Let me just give a minute here to see if anyone else joins in, and then I'll start in about a minute. We're just waiting here for about 30 seconds. Trying to see if anybody else joins in. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jyotsna Pandey. I am Public Policy Manager at the American Institute of Biological Sciences. I've corresponded with several of you over emails regarding our upcoming event, the 10th Annual Biological Sciences Congressional District Visits. Thank you for joining us today for this live online training program for the event. I just want to note here that we are recording this webinar today. The entire presentation along with the Q&A session will be posted on the AIBS website if you want to refer to it in the future, as well as for event participants who are not able to join us today for the live webinar. A few housekeeping items before I start. The audio for the webinar is coming in through the speakers on your computer or phone or tablet. In case you are having trouble hearing or any other technical difficulties, please use the chat icon at the bottom of the screen to reach out privately to Diane. She's listed as the IT support. If you have questions regarding the content of the presentation or about the event, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen to enter questions. So the chat icon for technical difficulties and the Q&A icon for any questions that you might have. And you may enter the questions during the presentation, but I will address them at the end of the presentation. I'll go through all the questions and try my best to answer them towards the end of this webinar. So, okay, that's it for the logistical things. So let's go ahead and get started with the webinar. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background information about the event to provide some context about what the initiative is about. This will be the 10th year that the American Institute of Biological Sciences has organized the Biological Sciences Congressional District Visits event. We are pleased to have about 200 scientists participating this year, and we are excited to see such strong participation from the scientific community. We have a pretty good geographic diversity this year, with 34 states being represented by at least one participant. And we're excited about the fact that we will be covering such a good number of states. Participants will be doing meetings or tours with both federal and state lawmakers, including US senators and House representatives, as well as state delegates and representatives and state senators. This event really complements some of the other events, initiatives, and activities that AIBS and our sponsors and supporters are engaged in, including the Congressional Visits Day that involves doing Hill meetings here in Washington, D.C., where the AIBS office is located. AIBS started this event 10 years ago when we realized that there were additional scientists and researchers, graduate students who wanted to be involved in science policy but couldn't necessarily travel to DC to meet with their members of Congress in person. So we started this event to help facilitate those kinds of meetings in their home districts, and a few years later expanded it to include state elected officials as targets of these meetings and tours. We're very pleased this year to have a robust list of sponsors for the event. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of these societies and organizations that include the American Society of Naturalists, Botanical Society of America, Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, Helminthological Society of Washington, Natural Science Collections Alliance, Paleontological Society, the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections, and the Society for the Study of Evolution. These groups all made financial contributions and helped with the outreach for these events, which we really appreciate. Also, if you're a member of any of these organizations, thank you for taking part. Now, This event helps to serve several needs within the science policy community. At the most basic level, this is an opportunity for scientists to educate lawmakers at the state and federal level about science, how it is important and how it benefits society. Many of you are participating in this event because you want to promote federal and state investments in research or science education programs. And this is an excellent platform to do that, and not only demonstrate to them how science happens, but how tax dollars are used to benefit their district or their state. We also recognize that this is a valuable opportunity to support and train advocates for science, particularly graduate students. I know that there's a lot of interest from grad students in getting involved, and we want to harness that energy and want to train people to be effective communicators of science and work well with policymakers. And the webinar today is a part of that effort. Meetings and tours also have to personalize science and put a face on science. It's an opportunity to show lawmakers how science happens, what it looks like, and who are the people engaged in science. There are not many elected officials who have backgrounds in science, so many of them don't know what the process is like. They might have stereotypes about who scientists are, and this is a great opportunity to bust some of those myths, especially for those of you who are hosting tours at your research facilities. Also, meetings are generally an effective means of communicating with lawmakers. Doing an in-person meeting is perceived to be the most effective means of influencing thoughts and potentially voting history of elected officials. There have been surveys that have been done by a nonprofit and nonpartisan Congressional Management Foundation that looked at a variety of advocacy techniques that are used. Congressional staff were asked about what exactly is going to change their boss's mind on an issue, and consistently, congressional staff say that an in-person visit by a constituent, that is, a person who lives in that lawmaker's district, has some or a lot of influence. Now, this is according to 97% of the congressional staff in DC and 94% of staff in district offices. And this holds true whether you're doing a meeting in Washington, DC or back in the district. So we recognize that the time and travel expenses are a barrier for a lot of people, and we're excited that so many of you can participate in the event this summer and fall. Now that I have given you some background about the event, let's get into the content about science policy. Hopefully, a lot of you already recognize that the federal government and state governments, to a lesser extent, play an exceptionally large role in science. Because Congress controls federal expenditures, ultimately, they're the ones determining what the budgets are for science research programs and education programs. They determine how much funding agencies have to put into particular grant programs. We all know that getting a grant is extremely competitive now, and only about 20% of grants are funded within the bio directorate at NSF and at NIH, or even within the competitive grants program at the Department of Agriculture. So those decisions are not necessarily being made by the agency, but have a lot to do with what elected officials are deciding to do higher up in the food chain. Elected officials are also making determinations to some extent about what research areas get prioritized. Are they putting money into climate research, or are they putting money into agriculture? Even within an agency, for instance, a few years ago, the National Science Foundation was heavily pursuing innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water as a part of a government-wide push to address climate change. There was a lot of pushback from Congress, and that proposal got scaled back, and that program is now being phased out. But there has been a bigger push towards understanding the rules of life and the connections between genome and physical traits now. So that's just one example of a situation where lawmakers are making decisions about which particular disciplines or subdisciplines are getting prioritized. Many of you may have also heard about some of the pushback to social and behavioral sciences that has been coming out of the House Science Committee in recent months. So that's also an example of that. Funding decisions made by Congress also affect what stages of the scientific career pipeline are getting supported. They make decisions about how much money proportionately is going into support for undergraduate research versus graduate research fellowship programs or postdoc programs, and how much would go towards early career researchers versus more senior researchers. To give you recent examples, the National Institutes of Health recently did a trial balloon on trying to redistribute some of the funding within their applicant pool, because they were recognizing consistently that about 10% of the researchers were getting 40% of the total grant funding. They were hoping for early career scientists to have a little bit bigger portion of the pie. The plans were ultimately abandoned because of some pushback from the community. So that's another example of how lawmakers might impact science. Government also has influence on how you spend time as a researcher. What are the regulatory requirements or burdens in terms of paperwork for oversight when you have a grant, or if you're using, say, human research subjects or animal models? How much time does it take to fill out all that paperwork? Those sorts of things. And lastly, this is especially pertinent to the state level, elected officials have an impact on what is taught in science classrooms. In recent years, there have been attacks on the teaching of evolution in K-12 public classrooms in a number of states. Fortunately, most of these have failed, but there was a lot of time and effort spent by advocates around the country trying to make sure that evolution continues to be part of the curriculum in public schools. So we can see that funding decisions made by Congress have quite a big impact. It would be helpful to see the context of what the longer term funding trend has been. So this graph that I'm about to show you shows federal research and development spending as compared to the size of the US economy as measured by gross domestic product, which is shown on the y-axis as a percentage. And on the x-axis, you can see a 40-year timeline. So you can see that there has been ups and downs in terms of this metric over time, but it's largely been a downward trend. That's true across presidential administrations for the most part. If you consider that out of every $1 that you give to the government as taxes, about a quarter of that dollar gets spent on healthcare programs, roughly a quarter gets spent on defense, a bit less gets spent on job and family security, about 9 or 10% is spent on interest payments on the national debt, and the remaining quarter, roughly 30%, is every other program, such as education, agriculture, immigration, veterans affairs, law enforcement, and so forth. And the last 1% is roughly what gets spent on science. I should note that this data is from 2014, and as we move forward, I'll talk more about what science funding looks like right now. So federal spending can be classified into two different buckets. One is mandatory spending. Some people call them entitlement programs, while others might call it social safety net programs. This includes Social Security and Medicare. And once a program is created in law and the formula is set for when people qualify for benefits, the government has to pay that out. And Congress needs to change the underlying law to change what is set under mandatory spending. So mandatory spending has been a consistently growing portion of the federal spending over the past decades. Right now, more than 60% of all federal spending goes towards mandatory programs, and this is about double of what it was 50 years ago. All other programs can be classified under discretionary spending. This is everything from military to research and development, environmental conservation, education programs, transportation programs, foreign aid, and so on. For these programs, unlike the mandatory programs, Congress makes annual funding decisions about them through legislation, which fund the federal government. They decide, say, at what level the NSF should be funded at in the coming year, and also programs within NSF. They're making thousands of funding decisions across all the federal departments and agencies and programs within them. Because mandatory spending has been growing faster than discretionary spending, this has put a lot of pressure on discretionary spending, which has resulted in it becoming a fairly smaller portion of the federal budget at this point, roughly 35%. So over the years, the pressures on discretionary spending have resulted in overall shrinking and stagnant funds. So since 2009, there have been multiple programs, biological and ecological research programs, whose funding has shrunk. For instance, the ecosystems mission area within the US Geological Survey, the forest and rangeland research program within the Forest Service, and science and technology within the EPA all are funded at lower levels in actual dollars, not even taking into account inflation. There have been many other biological and ecological research programs that, although might have had some ups and downs over the years, the growth in their budget has not kept up with inflation. That includes the Biological and Environmental Research Program at the Department of Energy Office of Science, the National Institutes of Health, the Bio Directorate within NSF, and Intramural Research, the Agricultural Research Service at the US Department of Agriculture. So, but there are a couple of exceptions for biological research. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, is a notable one. NOAA has seen an increase in its budget over the past 9 or 10 years, although there have been some drivers for that. Large and expensive satellites that have been built in the past 8 or 9 years, and those costs have really increased the total funding for the agency. It's not necessarily because research has gotten more money for NOAA. Another notable exception would be the competitive research grants within the USDA, the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, or AFRI. But that has been a relatively new program, and that probably explains why it has seen growth in recent years, defying some of the trends that the other agencies have suffered. Although in 2019, both NOAA and AFRI are looking at lower funding. NOAA is facing a 7 or 13% cut, and AFRI is looking at a flat budget. So looking to next year's budget, many of you might be aware that President Trump recently released his initial budget request for 2019 in February. The request proposed deep cuts to nearly all research programs, including biological sciences. So I've listed a few here. Cuts as deep as nearly 40% for the ecosystems mission area within the USGS, 26% for biological research within DOE, 36% cut for science and technology at EPA. So budgets for a multitude of agencies were slated for a 20% or more cut, although NSF and NIH are facing slightly smaller cuts. In addition, there were some research programs that were proposed for elimination, including ARPA-E, which does energy research at the DOE, the Sea Grant program within NOAA, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is the primary source of federal support for the nation's libraries and museums. At USGS, the Biological Survey Unit, which is a group of USGS scientists who curate and conduct research on bird, mammalian, and reptilian collections at the Natural History Museum, was also slated for elimination, along with the cooperative research units, which facilitate research between agencies and train graduate students in fisheries and wildlife sciences. So now, fortunately, the president's budget request is, like its name suggests, only a request. Congress ultimately decides the funding levels, an authority that's been granted by the US Constitution. In the last couple of months, Congress has been taking up the issue of 2019 spending. They have to ultimately pass 12 appropriations bills. That's what the spending bills are called. And those 12 bills collectively fund the entire US government. Now, many of those bills have science programs within them. Congress is still working on most of these bills, so some of these numbers can still change. Most of these bills have moved further along in the House at this point than the Senate. The Senate is usually a little bit slower to take up and write their spending bills. And that is the case this year and as in most years. But there is good news and bad news in terms of what's happening in Congress at the moment. The good news is that the funding levels being proposed are not within the president's budget request. For the most part, they've rejected the deep cuts requested by President Trump for most of the science programs. The bad news is that some of the programs we're still looking at potential cuts or flat budgets, while others are slated for slight increases. Now, in this list that I have here, the numbers in the brackets represent the president's request, and the number on the left is the number on the Senate bill, and the right represents the House bill. So these are all relative to the budget numbers from last year, that is 2018. For example, for NSF, the president has proposed a 4% cut but the Senate bill would provide a 4% increase and the House would provide a 5% increase. Now, NSF and NIH are looking at small budget increases in 2019. The ecosystems mission area within USGS is looking at a flat budget. The biological and environmental research program at the DOE Office of Science is looking at either a 6% increase or flat funding. The science program at EPA would either see a flat budget or a 9% cut. NOAA is facing a budget cut somewhere between 7 and 13%, as I mentioned earlier. Intramural research at the USDA is looking either at a 3% cut or a small 4% increase. Congress so far has rejected the proposal to eliminate some of the programs that we talked about in the last slide, like ARPA-E, Sea Grant, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the cooperative research units. There is some variation between the House and Senate numbers for some of these programs, but overall, there's still room for improvement, which is why it is important for you all to be involved in advocating for science funding. And meet with your lawmakers, whether federal or state, back in the district. As I mentioned earlier, an in-person meeting by a constituent is incredibly impactful in shaping a legislator's views on an issue. Some of you are hosting tours at your research facility, and that is a great way to put a face to the name of a facility that the legislators might perhaps only have heard of. The overarching goal for this event is that you all will be able to show your lawmakers what the direct benefits of science are in their district or region. So now what we're going to focus on is how do you formulate the right message for the meeting or tour that you're doing, and how do you deliver that effectively? But first of all, you need to know who your audience is before you start. Are you meeting with federal or state elected officials or their staff? Because in many cases, you wouldn't be able to meet with the lawmaker or have them out for the tour. And in that case, their staff will make themselves available. The following tips will also apply if you were meeting with someone who works for a government agency or even university leadership. So start by asking yourself some questions to figure out who your audience is, so that you can come up with the right message and content to deliver to them. Are they fellow scientists? If you're meeting with an elected official or staff, that is quite unlikely. We will get into that in the next slide. What about their knowledge level? In most cases, elected officials and their staff are college graduates or may even have further advanced degrees, but it has probably been years since they took a biology class in high school or as an undergraduate. What are their interests? Do a quick Google search about them or go through their website. Read about what issues they support. Do they have a hobby or something that you could use to capture their interest or to reel them in? You need to be aware of their beliefs, particularly if you work on an issue that is considered contentious for some people. For example, climate change or evolution education or evolution research. Now, why should they care about what you have to say? Again, it's helpful to find common interest, common ground, so that you can present your information in a way that actually engages them and makes them care about what you have to say. Maybe they actually do care, but they just haven't made that connection yet. Now we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides. But let's start with who lawmakers are. On this slide, the font size of each of the words is proportional to the number of members of Congress who identify with or are from that profession. So it won't surprise you that many members of Congress identify as being politicians or in public service, but many have a background in business or come from law or education backgrounds. And that little smudge there at the bottom that is really hard to read, that is science and engineering. There are only a handful of scientists and engineers in Congress. And at present, and to my knowledge, there's only one biologist, Representative Rob Whitman from Virginia, Representative Louis Slaughter from New York, who was also a biologist, recently died, sadly. Don't have science backgrounds unless they are, say, a fellow from AAAS or a Knauss fellow. There are sometimes people who are on detail from federal agencies and are temporarily posted in a congressional office. But besides these folks, it's rare to meet someone who has a background in science. Also, I should note here that if you have a meeting with just staff instead of the elected official, don't be surprised by the fact that the staff members are quite young, in their 20s or 30s. On average, they've been in their positions for about a year or two. It's usually longer in the Senate than in the House. So it's possible that you might be the first person talking to that staff member about a science-related matter. So to know your audience, it's important to do your research on the lawmaker, even if you're meeting with their staff, because the staff represent the views of their boss. You want to find out what positions the policymaker has previously taken on an issue that you want to talk to them about, whether you're there to talk about funding for the National Science Foundation or state support for undergraduate education. Check to see if that lawmaker has sponsored or co-sponsored any legislation on that topic. Have they ever written any op-eds on the issue, or what press releases are posted on their website? If you look at their website, in most cases, there will be a page on issues or legislation or something like that that reveals a lot about what issues are a priority for the elected official. You won't find many members of Congress who list science as an issue on their website, but they might mention something like education. But sometimes what they don't mention on their website can also be useful. You can also do a general Google search and read any news articles about them. I would also encourage that you think outside the box, look at their biography. Maybe they have their hobbies or their interests outside of work listed. That can sometimes be useful. Even their education or professional background and family interests can all be pertinent as you're doing your homework. Ultimately, what you want to do is to take the person's current knowledge and level and the perceptions of a topic and connect the dots with what you want to share with them. For example, if a lawmaker that you're meeting with says in their bio that they are interested in, say, sports fishing, that would be a great place to start when talking about your water quality research or conservation, for example. As another example, if you're coming in to talk about funding levels for a research program and the lawmaker has not listed science or investments in R&D as an issue on their website, you might want to start with talking about how research investments have impacted economic development in the region. You can make a connection by talking about how science helps to support jobs and training of future skilled workers. So that would be a good place to start. Because your goal is to tailor your message based on the views of your audience, based on the homework that you've done about them, so you need to be careful about how you craft the message based on who your audience is. So I'm going to give you an extreme example here. If you were interested in talking about climate change adaptation, and let's say you were going to have two meetings, one with Senator Edward Markey and the other with Senator James Inhofe, you would tailor your message differently. Senator Markey is a big proponent of the government taking action to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So based on your research, you would know that when you go into that office, the person would acknowledge that climate change is happening and that humans are causing it to some extent. And they're going to respect the fact that you're a scientist and trust the information that you're bringing in. You can probably just get right into talking about what your research is finding and how you hope that the government will use that information. On the other hand, Senator Jim Inhofe is a self-proclaimed climate change denier. You would take a different tact when talking with his staff. You would probably need to start by talking about climate change. For example, you could talk about how your research is showing that changing water availability is impacting agriculture, say, and then build up to the point that science shows that this is because of climate change. So you can see how you would need to take a different approach with the two offices, even though you're ultimately trying to convey the same message. In summary, it's important to remember that all politics are local. The more that you can draw upon local examples or point to specific instances in your area, in that lawmaker's district, the better the message is going to resonate with them. Now, once you have figured out who your audience is, you have an idea of what kind of message might resonate with them, it is important to think about how you should actually communicate that message. Remember that facts do not necessarily change the mind of elected officials. Policymakers need to consider a lot of different factors when making decisions about a particular piece of legislation or the issues they're going to take up. And facts are certainly one of them, but so are their own personal beliefs and the pressure that they might be getting from their party leadership. Now, the views of their constituents and their donors are also an important factor. Also, what are the economic costs? What are the trade-offs with other issues that they might care more about? So if you just come in with some great statistics and talk about your research, that might not necessarily be enough to change the lawmaker's mind on an issue. So it's imperative that scientists think about a different way to present information. As scientists, we are very focused on methodology. So for example, if I want to describe my own graduate research as a scientist, I would be tempted to say something like, I used fluorescent labeling and microscopy to study the formation of lignin in plant cell walls. Now that is very focused on the how of what I'm doing or the methodology. But I would really encourage you to think about why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is this research interesting or important? So if I want to reframe the earlier description, I would say, I study the formation of plant cell structure to improve the efficiency and lower the costs of producing biofuels. Similarly, I would encourage you to think about the bigger picture and the broader implications of your work. So here are a few ways that you can do that. You don't need to go for all of these, but if you can make one or two connections with your research, that's great. So if you look back at the example that I talked about regarding biofuels, environmental sustainability and innovation would be great connections. So you should also keep in mind that lawmakers are increasingly looking at issues through an ideological or partisan lens. They're probably much more aware of how their constituents and voters in their district feel about an issue. And they'll be concerned about being out of step with what those voters are thinking about. So think about this as you frame your message. A tool that we recommend as you are preparing your content for the meeting is called the communications triangle. It's shown here on the screen. The basic idea is to help you come up with the summary of what you have to say. That's in the middle of the triangle called your main message. You can think of it as a headline or a big idea. And then you can have 3 talking points that support that main message. I would encourage you to write a main message that's about 140 characters or less. That's about the length of a tweet. Well, it used to be the shorter tweet. It's not a hard and fast rule, but just a general guideline. If you aren't able to distill down your primary objective for having that meeting to something that short, you might need to still keep trimming your message. You can have more flexibility with the talking points though. In general, I would stick to 3 talking points because it's easier for people to retain 3 pieces of information. Retention tends to drop off if you have more than 3 points. But you can have subpoints within a talking point, for instance, using a story or a statistic or an example of some, or a combination of some sort to back up a point that is totally acceptable. I would also encourage you to think about how you will transition between those talking points. I say that because you might plan to start with talking point number 1 and then go to number 2 and then to 3. But it might happen that once you start at talking point number 1, the person you're meeting with breaks in with a question or takes the conversation in a completely different direction. So then you might realize, okay, it makes more sense to go to point number 3 and then backtrack to number 2. So you'll be better prepared if you have come up with your transitional phrasing in advance. I'll go over a couple of examples here. First for a federal lawmaker, and then on the next slide for a state lawmaker. Now, many of you signed up for this event to talk about funding for a federal research or science education program. So this example triangle is based on that. So if the big idea is that federal support for biological research is important to the country, your first talking point may be how public investments in research pay off. That is, it generates new discoveries and innovations that improve the lives of Americans, as well as new patents that help to advance US globally. You can, you can mention how your university benefits from these investments. Then you might transition into talking about how that funding is incredibly competitive to receive, that many programs have funding rates of less than 20%, which means for every 5 grant proposals that are submitted, only 1 gets funded. Even though many of them are highly rated, there isn't just enough funding available. And then you would transition to the last point about how more predictable and sustained funding is needed to allow American innovation to continue and thrive. Now, that's a really condensed version of what those talking points would look like, to give you an idea about how to use the triangle when coming up with your message. I'll also note here that we have more detailed talking points on the AIBS website. I'll share the link with you in a few slides and at the end of the presentation. And I'll also include that when I send out the video of this webinar. But on the AIBS website, there's a resource page where you can download more detailed talking points as well as other resources that might be helpful to you. Okay. Now, moving on to the next example, the message was intended for a state official around support for the state for undergraduate science education, say. You would now want to focus on things that are within the state purview, such as preparing the next generation of workers and how the university plays a part in that, perhaps by providing research opportunities to undergraduate students. Then you might want to use a personal story to talk about students that you've trained, or maybe how an undergraduate research opportunity motivated you or enabled you to pursue a career in science. Stories are a really great tool. They resonate well with elected officials. It's something that they can really wrap their heads around, certainly a lot better than statistics or numbers. Now, at the end of the day, the content is going to vary a lot from person to person. A diverse group of people with a lot of different interests have signed up for this event. And the examples I just talked about were just examples. So please feel free to customize the triangle based on your own research and interests and what you described on your registration forms. Okay, so now let's talk about the structure of these meetings. So if you have not done an office meeting with an elected official before, you might be surprised that the meetings tend to be fairly short. They can be as short as 5 minutes and typically don't go for more than 30 minutes. It might be a bit different for district office meetings, which might go on for a little bit longer than 5 minutes. But because these meetings are relatively short, you should plan on getting to the point quickly. When you get there, you should first introduce yourself and exchange business cards. So do remember to bring those and provide them to the person that you're meeting with. I would encourage you to start with a thank you. It can be as simple as, thank you for taking the time to meet with me, but perhaps, you can, based on your homework that you did on the elected official, you might have something more specific. For example, you might be able to say something like, I really appreciate that the senator has been a consistent supporter of research funding, or that he voted to increase funding for NIH or NSF last month when that came before the committee, or thank you for rejecting the president's budget cuts for a specific program at NSF. So you can be more specific. Those are great. Then you'll communicate your message. That's the one that you would develop based on the communications triangle, and then go through your talking points. Feel free to bring along some handouts or leave behinds. Here's a couple of examples of handouts. These are handouts that are already prepared and available for your use on the AIBS website. And the link is at the bottom. That is where you will also find sample talking points, which I talked about earlier. The link will show up again in a couple more slides if you're not able to get it down now. And I'll also be sending it along by email. On the left here, we have a handout that talks about the importance of government investments in biological research and how that pays off for the nation. And on the right is a handout on place-based biological research. For instance, field stations, museums, and botanic gardens, and what role they play in research. So feel free to provide handouts to whomever you're meeting with, but not too many, maybe one or two. You certainly want to allow time for dialogue and questions. It shouldn't be just you dominating the conversation and using up all the time yourself. As the meeting wraps up, you can offer to be of service again in the future, because this really is an opportunity for you to build a relationship with that office. It's not just a one-time transactional type of thing. And lastly, thank them again for meeting with you. Now, it's important that you go into such meetings with the mindset that you're there to learn as well. There's a nice quote by Bill Nye, the science guy. Everyone you will ever meet knows something that you don't. So you certainly have information that you're going to be sharing with these folks that you're meeting with. But you can also learn things from them during the course of that meeting. Some of these questions, as listed here, you might have already been able to answer from your research, but most likely not all of them. So for example, where is the policymaker on a specific issue? Are they supportive? Are they opposed? Are they ambivalent? Do they have particular concerns about specific bill? Maybe they have concerns about trade-offs with other areas that are a higher priority for them. Are there other groups that they are hearing from? Or perhaps are there the groups who haven't weighed in but could be influential with them? For instance, the university president or the teachers union or someone else could get involved. So again, it's about building a relationship. Something that has happened time and again is that one meeting with a particular office has led to another. Participants have started with their first interaction with the lawmakers for office, perhaps a staff level meeting during this event, but that has led to meetings with elected officials directly or to tours of research facilities down the road. And the relationship might even extend to you being able to weigh in on legislation that the office is drafting or working on, or even becoming a resource to the office on that topic going forward. So we hope that you'll all be interested in staying engaged and building upon your experience this summer and fall with continued interactions with these offices in the future. And for anyone who is still a little bit uncertain or unclear about exactly what one of these meetings might look like, especially if you've never done one before, we have an example of a mock meeting posted on the AIBS website. Again, it's the same link that you saw a couple of slides ago. That mock meeting is a bit generic, but it might be helpful for folks who are meeting with the Congressional District Office. Now, so we have many folks here who are interested in arranging for tours at their research facilities. So the tips I provided earlier about how to prepare your messaging pertains to tours as well, but of course the structure is slightly different. The big difference is length. Typically these tours we hear last anywhere from an hour up to half a day, and sometimes even a full day. You just need to make sure that you ask that question when you're in the process of scheduling the tour with the lawmaker staff, so that everyone is clear and about what the expectations are, and also that you can prepare the right amount of content for that length of time. I also encourage you to think about some of the other details, like where are you going to have the lawmaker or staff or whoever's coming to meet you, like where are you going to meet them? Try to find a place that is going to be easy enough for them to find and hopefully represent your facility well. You should decide on what the route is and what the stops are in advance for the tour. That's especially important if you have a lawmaker coming out who might have health issues or maybe of more advanced age. A few years ago, we had an issue where the lawmaker was recovering from surgery, so the university ended up arranging for a golf cart to pick her up at her car and then drive her to the facility. They also tried to minimize any standing or walking time to accommodate her health issues. So if there are going to be multiple people from your facility who will be speaking, which is a great thing, and we definitely encourage that, just make sure you coordinate your messaging with them, plan out how much time each person has and what topics will be covered by each person and the sequence in which the topics will be covered, so that there's no overlap and all the right context is being provided at each of the stops. So lastly, I would definitely encourage you to get your government relations people or public affairs people or whatever they might be called at your organization involved in this. You don't want them surprised when your elected official shows up on campus or the facility. And yeah, so definitely keep those folks involved. And we also have additional tips available in a handout on that resources page on the AIBS website that I just mentioned. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to prepare for the meeting. This involves not only learning about your legislator, but also having a couple of quick facts available at your fingertips or in your memory when you go into these meetings. You could perhaps talk about economic or societal benefits of research to your particular district or university or organization. And that could be anything from the amount of research funding the university receives each year to how many students you train in your own lab each year. Personal examples are really great. You can talk about how you can talk about your own experience of applying for grants or being a graduate student and what that graduate research fellowship meant to you. Those sorts of things. I would also recommend that you think about how to handle the situation if things go a little bit south and you get some pushback or some tough questions. That likely will not be the case for most of you, even if you're meeting with a lawmaker or their staff who have not always been friendly on a particular issue. For the most part, if you're a voter, and which all of you are in the districts where you will be having these meetings, they tend to want to be polite even if they don't agree. But do think about the policy implications of your research, or if they're going to, like how you would deal with it if they try to cast some doubt about the science or give some pushback about the cost of programs, those sorts of things. Just think about how you might want to address some of those questions. Okay, so here are a few tips to help you communicate effectively. As I mentioned, these meetings are fairly short. So you want to be prepared. You want to get to the point quickly in the meeting and be succinct in getting your message across. Also try to stay on message. This is where the communications triangle is helpful, so that you are prepared even if you get some questions that go outside the realm of what you want to talk about. And you certainly can answer those questions, but by the end of the meeting, try to bring the conversation back to your big idea. I would encourage you to have a conversational tone and pace, as if you were speaking with a friend. Try to avoid scientific jargon and acronyms, even for things that you might think are obvious. If you want to talk about, say, NSF, don't say NSF, say the National Science Foundation. If the staff or lawmaker that you're talking to themselves say NSF, then you are okay to use that acronym. But otherwise, it's best to avoid any acronyms, and same for scientific jargon. It's going to vary, of course, by your audience, but assume that these folks are at the level of undergraduate students in terms of science. And you want to generally be positive and respectful, and you want to leave them with a good impression of you. Again, the importance of effective communication and having the right message for the right audience. So now there are some pitfalls that you want to avoid. Avoid partisanship. Most offices aren't going to go there, but they might. If that happens, you don't want to say anything that might reflect poorly on your employer. You would want to politely find a way to steer the conversation to more neutral ground. If you get any questions that you don't know the answer to, you can definitely say that you don't know or are not comfortable answering that. But you might know someone who might be able to, and you can offer to put them in touch. Now, for some of you, depending on what your employer's policies are on interacting with elected officials, you might need to do this as yourself and not as an employee of the university or institution. Make sure that you get those policies clarified in advance. And yeah, some other things to avoid: don't bring too many handouts or leave behinds with you. I mentioned earlier that you're welcome to bring along some documents to leave behind, but I would encourage you to limit that to 1 or 2 things, and things that are relatively short. Typically, scientific papers are not the right thing to bring to these kind of meetings, and please take the time to Look at the documents that are on the AIBS website. That will give you a better sense of what kind of documents are appropriate. But generally, stick to brief documents. It's good to have pictures, and infographics are good. I would also advise against making any unrealistic demands or suggesting other programs to cut to increase funding for yours. If they ask you to suggest a program to cut, you can just politely say that it's not a decision, it's not your decision, it's a decision for the lawmaker to make. Lastly, I'll just say that staff really are important and they advise the lawmaker. So if you're not offered a meeting with the lawmaker, but just staff, it's still very much worth your time to take the staff level meeting or to bring them out for a tour. Now, in case you're wondering, what about, what should you wear for these things? I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, if you're doing a meeting in the district office, business attire would be appropriate. This picture was taken in DC during one of our events involving congressional meetings on the Hill. These folks are dressed appropriately with everybody in formal attire. For gentlemen, a suit and tie work well, and for ladies, a suit is great, or dress, or skirt and blouse, that sort of thing is appropriate. Of course, the tour is going to be more casual. Both these pictures are from tours that happened a couple of years ago. In both pictures, the gentleman on the left is a member of Congress, and the gentleman on the right is the researcher. And as you can see, something like button-down shirt or polo shirt with khakis is appropriate. And I'll also note here that if you're planning to bring people out to a field site or something like that, just give the office a heads up and let them know if they need to wear anything in particular. For example, they might need to wear a hat to protect themselves from the sun, or they might need to wear sneakers or hiking boots if there's walking involved on uneven ground. Just be clear about that up front, because otherwise they'll assume that they'll be walking on nice level ground and they don't have anything to worry about in terms of weather conditions and that sort of thing. Now, before we get into questions, let me just mention a few logistical things regarding the meeting scheduling here. I'm now working on starting to schedule the meetings. I've emailed about a third of you so far, and most of you have been pretty great at responding quickly and promptly. And I'll be working with each one of you directly to submit a meeting request. So if you haven't already, you'll soon be getting an email from me about submitting the meeting requests. So I would encourage you to respond as quickly as possible, because we don't want to delay too long, especially if you want to get a meeting next month when Congress is in recess, that is in August. Well, the House is in recess. Senate has a pretty short recess this year, just a week long. So I'll basically be working with you to determine what office you're interested in meeting and what type of meeting you're interested in arranging. And once you and I over email have agreed on these specifics and any other details such as time frame, I'll submit the meeting request and let you know that I've done that. And in all cases, I'll list you as the point of contact. I'll list the participant as the point of contact for scheduling. So when you hear from that office, please respond to them, take care of scheduling the meeting from that point on, like whatever specific details need to be decided on. Yeah, and be upfront about what how long the meeting is going to be, how many people are going to be involved. Like, be upfront about all that when you're talking to those offices. But also keep me in the loop and let me know once a meeting or tour has been set up. And if it so happens that a few weeks go by and you don't hear anything from that office, please let me know so that I can follow up with them and check where things are at. So after you've had your meeting or tour, I would encourage you to send a thank you note to the person that you met with. It can be a note in the email or in the mail or email. Either is fine. It doesn't hurt to remind them about what you talked about, but briefly, maybe in a sentence or two. And then if you promise them any sort of follow-up information, do remember to include that in your note. And we at AIBS would also love to learn about how your meetings went. So do write to us and let us know about your experience. If you took any pictures like the ones that you just saw a couple of slides ago, We would love to see those, and you can send these to me over email. And we hope that after this event, you will remain engaged in science policy. Some of you opted to sign up to receive our legislative action alerts as part of the AIBS Legislative Action Center. And I hope that the rest of you will also consider that. You can just go to policy.aibs.org and sign up from there. It's a great way to stay engaged and take action on any legislative issues related to science policy. And we also have a great free electronic newsletter called AIBS Public Policy Report, which goes out every 2 weeks on Mondays. So we encourage all of you to sign up for that. You can do that on the AIBS website or drop me an email and I'll sign you up for it. So if you want to stay up to date on what's happening in Washington and to lesser extent what's happening in the States in terms of science policy, that's a great resource. And again, I'd like to thank our event sponsors for their facilitation of this event and making it possible for all of you to be involved in science advocacy. And with that, we will go to questions. And I'll make a note here that the URL that I mentioned a few times in the webinar is on this slide. And all those resources that I talked about are online and available for your use. These include talking points, some example one-pages, which you're free to use. And I've also included some of the relevant budget numbers that I talked about on the talking points document, which some of you would hopefully find useful when you're framing your message. And yeah, with that, I'm going to invite any questions that you might have. It looks like we don't have any questions so far, but go ahead and type in any questions that you might have into the Q&A box, and I'll give you a couple of minutes here. Okay, and while we wait for the questions to come in, I just plug in that we will be sending out the link to the recording of this webinar over email. So you should receive that in the next day or two. I'll also include the link to that website where you can access all the resources that I talked about. But in the meantime, if people have other questions, I'm always happy to email or talk on the phone. Don't hesitate in reaching out. I'm happy to be a resource. I'll just give another minute here for people to type in their questions. I'll wait till about 4:30 to see if anybody has any questions, and then stop there. And I should also mention here that please, I know that a lot of you have signed up for the event and have indicated that there'll be other people participating with you in the meetings or tours that you're hoping to schedule. So please do share a recording of this webinar with them. It might help them with framing their message and giving them an idea about what these meetings look like. So yeah, feel free to share the webinar. All right, so I'm not seeing any more questions, any questions at all. So hopefully everything is all clear. So thank you again for participating today. I'm really glad that you could join us for the live event. I look forward to working with all of you as the event progresses over the next few months. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good one.